In Module 2, Myers introduces us to the 7 modern approaches or perspectives in modern psychology. So an important thing first to take into consideration when you're listening to a podcast is that you can pause me at any time and rewind and so forth, right? Listen again. But don't get confused with nomenclature, right? The names we use. Some textbooks will use the schools in psychology, some will use approaches, some will use perspectives. They're all synonyms meaning the same thing. And then, of course, there are subfields and professions within psychology, like a subfield would be developmental psychology. And the point here is that by this point you should know those 7 approaches. I can be a developmental psychologist, right? That's a subfield where I study how humans change over time, maybe from adolescence to adulthood, or I could focus just on early childhood development. And within that regard, I can be a developmental psychologist, that's my subfield, and I can come at it from a cognitive perspective. I can focus more on the biological side of development. I could also be what's called eclectic. And I can combine multiple perspectives as a developmental psychologist. So it's not as clear-cut as sometimes the textbook presents to you. There's a complexity to this. But let's get into the approaches. So at this point, you should know all of these approaches. A good way to study for this is what we did in at least one section of class. And that would be simply see if you can list the 7 approaches. You should be able at this point to list them pretty unproblematically. The next step would be to describe them. Okay? What I would also do for each one, and I'll use humanistic as an example, is I would create the analogy of, I would compare how to study for these approaches to constructing, say, atoms for specific chemical elements. So for instance, you know the basic structure is we have a nucleus, and then in ellipses going around the nucleus, we have electrons, which are negatively charged, right? So we have these particles going around. So imagine humanistic, right, as the nucleus, right? Going around, orbiting around humanistic, I would put detail. So for instance, at that first elliptical, half elliptical here, just for the sake of space, what I would do is like put things like Carl Rogers, Maslow. So those are some of the people that are prominent in this field. I might even put terms like self-actualization, which is connected to Maslow, right? So those are key terms. And then obviously define it. And then maybe out here, right? I'm not going in any particular order here of importance. I'm just doing it. You might describe humanistic psychology, right? It emerges in the 60s. It is a reaction against behaviorism and psychoanalysis, right? It believes that people are ultimately free to make their own choices and that people are inherently good and they want to self-actualize. They want to be the best they can be. Therefore, environments can help or can hinder people from becoming the best they can be. So it's important to create supportive environments that allow people to thrive. Right? So these are all things you can add there, and I would do that for each one when applicable, right? Some of the perspectives don't have particular people that are connected to them. Like in the biological perspective, I don't think we learned any specific people. But be that as it may, some of the others we did. Okay. Another point of confusion, and I'm on page 11 in the textbook, 11 and 12, if you need to follow along, is the difference between the perspectives and the levels of analysis. Okay, the perspectives are the specific approaches that psychologists often take. They specialize. So they specialize in whatever topics they may be looking at. They approach the topic from a particular perspective, right? So a biological a psychologist who comes at topics or subject matter from the biological perspective is going to look at whatever the topic is, probably in relationship to hormones, neurotransmitters, brain structures, right? Basically physiological functions, how that determines or impacts or affects, say, behavior or mental processes, right? And usually the focal point of their research will be very specific. What the levels of analysis show is that in many instances in modern day psychology, what we believe is the most complete way of tackling the complexities of human behaviors and mental processes, to get the most complete picture of whatever the topic may be, it's important to take what's considered an eclectic approach. And an eclectic approach takes into consideration, say, the complexity of something. Let's use depression. This is a very, very complex topic. What causes it? Is it primarily low levels of serotonin, a neurotransmitter? Is it the environment people find themselves in? Could it be other environmental factors? Could it be the loss of, say, a job, a loved one, frustration, right? So what this kind of levels of analysis section is focused on? It's about to best understand depression. To best understand, say, its causes, to describe it, remember, to explain it, and potentially to manipulate the behavior so we can make people have less depression. The most complete picture we can get is if we approach this eclectic perspective called the biopsychosocial approach. Okay? Which means we take into consideration multiple aspects that may influence people experiencing depression. So does that mean that no modern day psychologists are only cognitive psychologists or only biological or evolutionary? No, some still are. But what we're trying to say is that if we want to understand depression, we have to combine perspectives and take the insights from multiple perspectives to fully understand, or to better understand depression, or whatever subject matter goes there. You would have to take a eclectic approach. The eclectic approach takes into consideration all of these factors. Here's a great example to kind of just show you. Researchers were looking at, they showed a football game, a college football game between two schools. Let's say it was, I can't remember the actual schools, but let's just say it was Texas A&M versus Cal. Okay, I don't even know if those two teams play each other, but let's just say they do, right? So Texas A&M versus Cal. They showed them the game. They showed them the footage of the game, and then they asked them questions about the game. And what was interesting was students from Texas A&M were more likely to say that Cal players committed penalties. Cal students were more likely to say that Texas A&M committed penalties. The refs were unfair to, their team, etc. What this shows is that things like motivation and beliefs impacts, sorry about my handwriting, it's really hard to write with this pen. Motivation and beliefs impact our perception. That's the psychological aspect of the levels of analysis. So whenever we're dealing with, say, depression, you can put aggression there, you can put whatever topic you want, we can put how human memory works. We know that motivation, that would fall under the psychological aspect. Our desires, our motivations, our beliefs can influence whatever topic we're dealing with, depression, aggression, etc. Also, the presence of other people, right? Remember I gave you that example, at least in one of the blocks, about trolling, right? This online heinous behavior, right? As more people do it, does it make it more likely for future people to actually engage in that. So the social is extremely important because we know that when we are in groups, we could feel pressure from groups and we can act differently in groups. The presence of other people affects how we behave. Also things like cultural norms, what's accepted, can influence how we behave or what we don't do. And obviously the biological is, I think, self-explanatory, right? How our brains work, how our hormones affect us, right? How level of neurotransmitters. So this is basically saying the best way to understand behavior or mental processes is to actually combine, to take multiple approaches to understanding behavior. And that'll give us the best bet at coming to a fuller understanding of whatever it is we're studying.